Blur, Parklife.
Over the next 30 minutes, we'll hear from Damon Albarn about the highs of making Parklife.
It's certainly not flawless, but it's got a good soul to it, I think, you know. It brought a lot of problems, but making it was a joy.
And the lows of its subsequent success.
It rocked the foundations of everything I kind of been striving for.
It's obvious, really, but so much of pop music history is about being in the right place at the right time. Tonight's story is both a lesson in how to get it right and what happens when it goes wrong. When they first emerged at the end of 1990, Blur were the perfect group for the moment. A mix of looks and attitude, swagger and style that propelled them into the charts with their first hit, There's No Other Way, and their debut album, Leisure. By the time they came to their follow-up, though, they'd been overtaken by events from across the Atlantic. The American music invasion, led by Nirvana, had all but taken over. And though their second album, Modern Life is Rubbish, was in fact a better record than Leisure, it struggled commercially, with all three singles from it stalling just inside the top 30. For a while, Blur, who'd also played a couple of disastrous London gigs around the time, were written off by critics and fans alike. The band themselves, though, trooped on regardless.
I associate pre-Parklife as being sort of formative years. So I didn't really look at the kind of business and our relationship in any other way other than sort of we'd grown up together, you know, to that point. There wasn't that a sufficient pressure for it to have sort of infiltrated that very kind of tight little gang that we had. So really it was just sort of still having a laugh, really.
The gang had had a turbulent time recording Modern Life, with entire sessions being turned down by their label. But the effort was worth it. Modern Life is Rubbish improved with every listen. And in the end, it helped form the basis for Parklife's success. Food Records boss Andy Ross.
I think the lead up to Parklife was really all set in motion by the release of Modern Life is Rubbish, which was released approximately a year before it. And when Modern Life is Rubbish was released, it came out to general lack of enthusiasm at the time from the press, and it was only over the course of the next few months that it began to dawn on press principally and radio to a lesser extent that Modern Life is Rubbish was actually a very good album. The press coverage had been quite minimal, really. No front covers when that album came out. They played at Reading that summer and headlined the Tent, and that was quite a turning point. They got their first principal cover pretty much off the back of that, by which time Modern Life is Rubbish was effectively 6 months old, and Parklife was to come out only 6 months after that. So the perception of Blur changed quite radically, and I think that people felt that they'd missed an opportunity to lump onto Blur as a happening band when Modern Life is Rubbish came out. So there was a degree of overcompensation, I think, from the press. Suddenly everyone was falling over themselves to welcome Blur back into the fold, and I think that Parklife represented the perfect object for everyone to get back on board. Everyone was up for Parklife.
Some of the songs that became Parklife first had an airing on a Mark Goodyear session on Radio 1 in 1993, not long after Modern Life had entered the shops. Among the tracks on the session were early versions of Bank Holiday and Parklife, two tracks which summed up Damon's resilient, although sometimes hit and miss, songwriting style.
I write with just a very small little tape recorder in hotel rooms and just mumble, and then I listen to them back, and then the bits that kind of I think could be taken on, I'd make 4-track demos of them. But I never actually write words ever for them. I just mumble words that feel right rhythmically, and then stick with them. Parklife was just. I mean, the only bit that I think I'd actually written was all the people, so many people, and the rest was just virtually made up on the spot.
In late 93, the band returned to the Maison Rouge studios in London, where they recorded their first 2 LPs. Producer Stephen Street, who'd contributed to both the earlier albums, went with them.
Damon, he has a pretty good, clear idea of how he wants something to sound. You can tell whether it's going to be an exotic ballad or a very, primal, stripped-down, punky type song like Bank Holiday, for instance. So there's certain natural routes that you take when you're first presented with a song. by him. Obviously, Graham has a lot of say about how he wants his guitar to sound, and my job is to make sure that, you know, that I make them sound like Blur, you know, that I don't let it go too far in one direction, and I don't stand in the way where they should progress as well. I mean, Girls and Boys, for instance, you know, I mean, that was so obvious to me when Damon first played it to me that should be. I'd programmed 120 BPM disco type record because that's what it needed. So I said, look, no, we won't do live drums on this tune. You know, this is going to be a real out and out 120 BPM disco record. And they were happy to go along with that. And once you've got Graham's kind of angular distorted guitar on top, it turns into a Blur track again. But initially we started off with a very basic kind of disco programmed rhythm track.
Girls who want boys who like boys, big girls who do boys like their girls who do girls like their boys. Always should be someone to really love.
Girls and Boys had first been played live at the end of the Modern Life is Rubbish tour. No one at the time, though, had a clue how important a record it would turn out to be. Remember, it was a relatively bleak time in 1993 for British pop. Nirvana were continuing to ride high on the success of In Utero, and it was American acts, both rock and rap, including Cypress Hill and Rage Against the Machine, who were the mainstays of the festival season. Back in London, Damon looked on as he disappeared in the opposite direction, hurtling headlong into a sea of British influences.
I was definitely more into English music. It wasn't just English music, it was English writers and everything. There was a very specific kind of Englishness, which from Ray Davies to Patrick Hamilton was that sort of lonely, slightly melancholic characters, all sort of floating around with not a great deal of sort of direction. You know, I got really into that. I mean, I could never get into it again, but at the time I really did sort of, it was quite a romance with those sort of characters which I had in my head. I suppose some of them were familiar in the sense that other people had written about variations of them, but if you're getting into that sort of Englishness, then you know, it has its characters, like folk tales have their characters, and, you know, it was Essex. I think I did have some sort of misplaced frustration about where I was brought up. Misplaced in the sense that until I put it into a record, it definitely found its place. But it certainly wouldn't feel natural to make a record like that now. What was nice about it was that no one really talked about what it would do or why we were doing it. It just sort of it evolved very naturally. So I don't think there was any song that we really got to a point and then just couldn't take it any further. I only have good memories really of that whole period. And at that point, I think we were all fairly calm.
Although Blur were quietly confident with what they were doing, there was still some suspicion from the critics. Typical of the dissenters, the Melody Makers sent the Stud Brothers to interview the band during the recording of Parklife. They, like many people, were in for a shock.
They were quite ambivalent to sort of what we felt had happened that year, which was sort of we built up this really strong following, and there was definitely a sense that there was an identity to it. You know, it wasn't just sort of aimless, there was very much a point to it. And they were kind of being very, this is very xenophobic, and I was disagreeing and saying, and then I think they were going on about, well, it all sounds like Small Faces. And then I remember taking them in and playing them. By this point they were really, really drunk, playing them Girls and Boys and enjoying them trying to sort of, assimilate it and equate it to the Small Faces or whatever. I think that was the point where I knew it definitely had something in that record that was a bit above, because you couldn't just sort of categorise it like that. It felt like it had its own life. It definitely had a sense that it deserved to be heard, I think.
Looking for girls who are boys, who like boys, to be girls who do boys like their girls, who do girls like their boys.
Girls and Boys was also one of the tracks that stood out to producer Stephen Street when Damon played him his demo version.
I remember him playing it to me, and we started working it, that afternoon, because we were so kind of vibed up about it. Because I said to him, Damon, this is your first top 5 single. Thank God I was right. I mean, the reaction to it was incredible. It's funny because the record company hadn't given me the authority, as it were, to record that particular song. At that time, the band was still having to present Food Records with demos of songs, and then Food Records would say, okay, you can go in and record, 1, 2, 3 and 4. And we had started recording some tracks for the album. Initially, I think Parklife and Jubilee were amongst the initial session. And then Damon played me a demo that he'd done of Girls and Boys, and I said, I've got to record that. So I actually started recording the song before I was given the authority to record it. So I spoke to Andy Ross on the phone. Andy Ross is from Food Records. And I said, Andy, we just recorded this new song called Girls and Boys. And I got this kind of... we haven't actually, given you, the authority to start recording that song yet. Well, Andy, you'll love it when you hear it. I promise you it's going to be a hit, And as I say, well, it's proved to be right.
Girls and Boys was a landmark track during the recording of Parklife, but for Damon, it was a completion of another new song around the time of him having an operation that really made him realise that they were onto something.
I think it was after we'd done This Is a Low, really, I thought, well, this is a proper song. I was worried about my operation, and we'd finished the backing track. I mean, it's only a little operation. It just had hernia from jumping around too much. And it was getting closer and closer. It was sort of, it had gone, I had about a week left, and this was the last track that had to be written. Well, I mean, I'd written it, I had the melodies and everything. I'd done a guide vocal, but I hadn't, and I had This Is a Low and a couple of lines, I think, for the verse. And I went back and I was just like really panicking at home 2 days before I was supposed to go in for the operation, and we were out of the studio. It's ridiculous, this, but it's true. Alex had given me a shipping forecast napkin that Christmas. It had all the weather stations, and I just sat down and I just made up this sort of poem that travelled around the whole of the British Isles, and it fitted perfectly. Lyrically, it's one of the best things I've ever done, just because it's very innocent, really. Parklife was another key point, when Phil's vocal worked on that. Because I did it first, and we were going to drop it. It definitely wasn't going to make the album. And then I was going to get him in to do a poem or read something over what ended up as The Debt Collector. But it got to the day that he was coming in, and I hadn't actually written anything. So I just sort of thought, well, there's this song which we're probably not going to use, so let's have a go.
With the songs coming together, Blur were en route to finishing the most important album of their career. The amazing thing we found out during the making of this programme, though, was that Parklife very nearly wasn't called Parklife at all. Cue shock revelation from Damon.
Parklife started off being called London and having a fruit and veg cart on the cover. It's true.
Really? It was going to be called London. And why did you change your mind?
That we changed.
Yeah, did you sober up, or?
Well, that was the last time that Dave Bouth was sort of privy to any decision or creative process with us, and that was his final contribution, was call it London. It's nice and simple.
Ding, da-ding, da-ding, London. No, it doesn't work, does it? As the release date approached, Blur suddenly found themselves sitting on a potentially huge record. Following their progress from inside the Blur camp, Food Records boss Andy Ross remembers hearing a rough mix of the album for the first time.
On first hearing of what was coming to be the finalised album, I think that my personal feelings about Parklife was that it was a very exuberant body of work. I suppose you could say more commercial. I don't know if that's necessarily a positive thing or not, but certainly there was a sort of swagger and confidence behind the album that hadn't really been present on Modern Life is Rubbish, because the atmosphere had changed. This just felt like something could happen, something big could happen. Not that we were aware that it was going to be as significant a record as it actually turned out.
The first single from Parklife, Girls and Boys, got its first play on Radio 1's Evening Session and went on to land the band on the front cover of the New Musical Express. Selects editor John Harris recalls the impact it made at the press.
I remember Girls and Boys coming out. We got a cassette of that in the office, and we were all expecting it to be something like For Tomorrow from Modern Life is Rubbish had been, to be kind of a bit kinksy and a bit David Bowie. Instead of which, it was this crazy sort of Euro disco number about going to Greece on your holidays. And I remember I'd got that and End of a Century as a trailer of the LP. I was working at the NME at the time. And the following day, without meaning to drop names, I went on the road with Paul Weller. And I took him this, and he was a huge Blur fan. So I put this tape on, and he hated Girls and Boys, because obviously it was quite synthetic and sort of mannered and pastiche. But he loved End of a Century, and I think that sort of indicated the fact that it was such an eclectic record that someone could passionately love one bit of it and hate another bit of it. Personally speaking, I loved all of it.
With advanced radio play, 12-inch promo copies in the clubs and rave reviews and trebles all round, Girls and Boys was released in March '94. Just as Stephen Street predicted, it became their first ever top 5 hit. And after nearly 2 years in the cold, Blur were once again in the right place at the right time. At the point when Parklife was released, the whole atmosphere of the British music scene was changing, for reasons which, in retrospect, were obvious. The tragic suicide of Kurt Cobain, a fortnight before Parklife hit the shops, signalled the end of the grunge era. With Nirvana, the leaders gone, our romantic affair with America soon began to dissolve. American music had become distant and uncomfortable, and it was losing its appeal. And anyway, things were happening on our own doorstep. The States might have been glamorous for a while, but Blur resurrected a certain pride, not just in British pop, but the British way of life. Parklife was clever and incisive and close to home. Giving it 9 out of 10, the NME reviewed Parklife saying, what 18 months ago looked like retrograde precociousness, sticking up for Little England as US culture steamrolled into Hertfordshire, is now little short of maverick genius. Nothing, however, had prepared Damon himself for this change in fortunes at the press. Behind the scenes, this sudden canonisation left the Blur singer entering one of the most traumatic points of his career.
I had the most miserable time of my entire life. It made me feel very, very insecure, and it rocked the foundations of everything I kind of been striving for, really. I was not prepared for people just suddenly, sort of almost unconditionally agreeing with me after having such a long period of just feeling a little bit out of it and having to kick against things. It did result in a prolonged period of sort of depression stroke physical sort of agitation, you know.
When the album was released, it went straight in at number 1, putting an end to Pink Floyd's 4-week run at the top with The Division Bell. But this just added to Damon's depression.
When the album went in at number 1, I was in an amazingly beautiful garden in some palace outside of Prague doing a video for To The End, but I was sort of lying in a room on my own going, oh God, we're in real agony. Just, I mean, anyone who's ever experienced real physical agitation in the sense that they feel, you know, heartbeat just goes crazy and you get a tight chest and everything, you know, that I was really feeling that, and it was terrible, you know. We were at number 1, and, you know, I was in this beautiful location, and I just felt totally miserable. It was really crap. By the time we got our Brits, I was feeling so bad. The only time I felt relief was when I was asleep or I was on stage. It was really horrible period, but it's hard. It's very hard to articulate why you're in the middle of it, because it's, you know, it's okay. I mean, I've got distance from it now, and I feel like it's easy to talk about, but it just escalated. And then I suppose at some point Oasis became a force, and it took on a totally different meaning from that point.
It would take Oasis a while before they took over the mantle of the People's Band, but Parklife's charge to the top of the album chart was symptomatic of the time. The bands who'd once been vilified for their Britishness were now being championed for exactly the same reason. They led a revival which quickly caught on, with records from the likes of Elastica and Pulp. Here's Jarvis Cocker.
I think Parklife came out kind of after our record, His and Hers. I think they came out around the same time, and their record did a lot better than ours, so I suppose I was probably jealous of that. And I think we were doing a signing in a record shop in Manchester, and you know, at those signings they always insist on playing your record, which is one of the most embarrassing things ever. So we said, oh, take it off, will you please? So they took our record off and they put Parklife on. I think that might have been the first time I really heard it. But I remember thinking, maybe that's the mark of a good album, is when it's not so much the actual songs on it, but the way they kind of fit together. It kind of slides past without you having to make any effort at all, and that's when you can kind of tell that a record is right. And I can remember hearing the first 3 tracks off that and thinking, this is better than our record in that it sounds more like a real record. Somehow it seems more official, seems to hang together. I don't like everything off that record, but it does, and I've not heard it for a real long time, but I can just remember being impressed by that. They got it right in that way, that it sounded real.
Through the summer of '94, armed with Girls and Boys as their anthem, Blur became the boisterous ringleaders of the new Britpop movement. They went back on the road as well, culminating in a huge show at London's Alexandra Palace. And that was just the start. Parklife spawned 4 top 20 singles and was nominated for the 1994 Mercury Music Prize. Meanwhile, the band went on to clean up in pretty much all the end-of-year polls, and their mainstream appeal was affirmed in February 1995 when they were nominated for and won 4 Brit Awards, including Best Band and Best Album. So what had prompted this amazing change in fortunes for the band? Select editor John Harris.
I think the main reason Parklife was the really key record in launching their career as huge stars was really, firstly, the simple quality of it and the strength of the songwriting and so on, but also because of the fact that people, by the time it came out, were just getting tired of the fact that Britain was so enthralled to America musically. And because it really wore its Englishness on its sleeve, I think that really appealed to people's need to feel that there was something worthwhile being created on their doorstep. And everyone always makes out that Blur, it's all about jolly japes and chimney sweep music, and it's nothing of the kind. The great thing about a lot of the songs on Parklife is they have this real sort of sighing sense of melancholy about arriving at your mid-20s and realising that running around and getting drunk all the time isn't necessarily the right way to behave. It's there in Badhead. Badhead's got a line in it about it's no surprise that today I'll get up around 2 for a lack of anything to do, which is a very mid-20s kind of feeling. To the End's got that line. To the End itself is a very melancholic song, but drinking far too much, none of us can think straight anymore. End of a century, your mind gets dirty as you get closer to 30. It's much more of a complicated and intelligent record than people have made out. It almost, in lyrical terms, sort of predates what Radiohead went on to do, saying that the modern world is both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. There's a lot of that on Parklife. The fact that it works as entertainment, it works as kind of intellectual music, etc., is absolutely fantastic.
Food Records boss Andy Ross.
I think the timing was just absolutely spot on, and that's not something you can plan ahead, but with hindsight, that was very much the case. I just think it shows a band really hitting a peak and doing it with total assurance, and it was fabulous to be associated with that album.
Following on from what they'd started with Modern Life is Rubbish, Blur had written another series of brilliant postcard pop songs. Snapshots of life in the UK in the 90s, from civil servants to Club 1830 holidays, from commuters to the weather forecast. It was very British and easy to relate to, and it was all done in a very British way. Up one minute, down the next, with a dry sense of humour and a fiver in its back pocket for a round of drinks. It was both articulate and accessible, and everyone had their own standout tracks. Here's Enemy editor Steve Sutherland.
I think This Is a Low is probably the greatest song written in the last 10 years. I mean, people always talk about Britpop with a kind of retrospective head on. They always refer back to the Kinks and the Beatles because basically, it was based in a traditional form of songwriting. But a song like This Is a Low, it is as good as anything that Ray Davies ever wrote for the Kinks or anything. It's an amazing song.
Not only was it a cracking record in its own right, but Parklife also ended up breathing new life and an air of new confidence into the British pop scene.
We're still living with it and other records' legacy, really, aren't we, in this country? It very quickly became more than just a record. It became a sort of pivotal point in a change in the culture, really. And whether the two were incidental or one sparked the other, I don't know. But people must have liked it because of the variation and that there were lots of stories. I can't imagine anyone putting a record like that out like that now and anyone being interested, really. Prior to it coming out, if it didn't sound like Nirvana, he didn't really stand a chance.
Post Parklife, bands no longer found it necessary to look to the States for their influences. Not only that, but the British industry had spent 3 or 4 years deriding the UK indie scene, suddenly turned full circle. Blur had proved that British guitar music needn't necessarily be trapped in a ghetto. In fact, the possibilities were endless. Mind you, you won't find Damon owning up to inventing Britpop.
To a degree, I suppose, there were a lot of bands that sort of appeared and were slightly embarrassed about. I think Parklife was just a little bit too eccentric for anyone for it to really spawn any. I think there are other bands whose music and outlook is a lot easier to ape. You can take one aspect of ours, but then a band that does that ends up looking very one-dimensional. I don't really want to be blamed for anything in particular.
5 years on, it's difficult to remember a world before Parklife. But believe me, there was one, and it was colder, darker, and a scarier place. The arrival of Blur as fully fledged pop stars opened the way for countless other groups to have their 15 minutes of fame. But for Blur, it gave the band a chance to show how they developed as songwriters and deft musicians. It was an inventive but commercial record, which simply blew most of the competition out of the water. Enemy editor, Steve Sutherland.
Personally, I think Parklife is probably the greatest album made out of this generation, out of the Britpop generation. I think it was... it makes me smile every time I hear it. It makes me laugh. I love it. I think it's clever songwriting, emotionally delivered. It's cheeky, it's slightly surreal, and it has a great sense of community. It's slightly about freaks, I suppose, different freaks in different areas of society. But it kind of is, it's kind of like it's okay to be a freak. And the song itself, Parklife, is just a great, funny anthem. I think you'd have to have a very hard heart not to break into a smile when you heard it. I mean, I was instrumental in putting Phil Daniels together with Blur because I knew Phil. I played football with Phil, and Damon rang up and wanted Phil's number, so I like to think I played a small part in that history. But I just remember those gigs around that time and everything. They were so exciting. They were such fun. It was such a celebration that Blur, who were over, they were dead and buried, everybody thought. And then they made a very good record called Modern Life is Rubbish, which very few people seemed to buy, but you could see it coming, and they really did. Out of a rather a silly, perhaps, anti-American thing, they really wanted to identify a voice for Britain. They wanted us to be proud of our pop music again, rather than looking across the pond, as it were, at Nirvana and grunge, which they felt in a way was stylistically quite interesting, but didn't really speak for their generation. And they were probably one of the last groups that actually wanted to make a form of music that was meaningful enough, that would say something for their generation.
Parklife has sold 2 million copies worldwide to date and has become a major landmark in British music in the 90s. Just when we needed someone to rejuvenate our faith in pop, Blur emerged bristling with confidence. The right band for the right time. For a change.
I think at the time it was very much out on a limb. I suppose the reason why it got so much attention was that it did so well, but came from such a sort of weird angle that people were genuinely surprised that, a record like that could do that well.
Despite Damon's depression following Parklife's success, there still isn't anything he'd change about the record.
It's certainly not flawless, but it's got a good soul to it, I think, It brought a lot of problems, but making it was a joy.
Finally, as ever with these shows, we have to sum up the record in 15 words to an alien from another planet. Take your time, Damon.
A series of cartoons about people who travel on trains and hit their heads against walls.
Not bad. We'll give you that.